You ever notice how the past has a way of staying quiet for years, just to wait for the one morning you finally feel like you have your feet under you to come roaring back and demand your attention? Well, that is exactly what happened to me when my phone started vibrating off the nightstand with a ghost from a life I thought I had buried deep in the dirt. My name is Olivia Carter, and these days I spend my time out in Denver, Colorado, working as a graphic designer, which is a pretty good life for a 32-year-old woman who started with nothing but. This morning I woke up to 29 missed calls from an Illinois area code that I hadn't seen in a lifetime, and I just sat there on the edge of my bed, staring at that glowing screen until the coffee in my hand went completely cold, because deep down in my soul, I already knew who was trying to reach me without even having to hear a single word of those voicemails. See, memories are a lot like shadows because they don't ever really go away, they just hang out in the dark corners of your mind until some ordinary Tuesday comes along and they decide to grab you by the collar and pull you all the way back to the beginning. For me, it only took one flashing number on a screen to turn me back into a terrified 12-year-old girl standing all alone in the middle of Union Station in Chicago, watching the two people who were supposed to be my protectors treat my fear like it was the funniest show on earth. My own mother actually left me at that train station as some kind of sick joke, and they even went so far as to put money on whether I could manage to find my way back home without any help. I can still feel that heavy hollow sensation in the pit of my stomach when I realized they weren't turning the car around, and every face in that crowded station looked like a threat, while the whole city felt too loud and too freezing for a little kid with nothing but a few coins in her pocket. That was the day my whole world split right down the middle. Into the girl I was before they left me, and the person I had to become to survive. After they did, I never went back to them. Not that night, and not in the 20 years that followed, because I went out and built myself a brand new life with a different name and a future so far removed from that house that I almost let myself believe they didn't exist anymore. But those 29 missed calls this morning proved that the past does not stay where you put it, because sometimes it decides to come looking for you, and it doesn't care if you are ready or not. I sometimes wonder if the weather where you are at right now feels like it matches your mood, because growing up in Willow Creek, Illinois taught me real fast that how things looked on the outside was the only thing that mattered to my family. To anyone driving past our house, we looked like the definition of a solid middle-class American dream, where hard work and good values were the law of the land. My folks owned a string of home goods stores that did pretty well, selling everything from kitchen mixers to discount coffee makers and all those little things people realize they need the second they see them on a shiny shelf. On the weekends, you could find my father out back at the grill, while my mother waved a friendly hello to the neighbors over the fence, making everyone believe we were the kind of family they ought to admire. But once the front door was shut tight, love was nothing more than a performance, and feeling safe depended entirely on whether my mother was bored enough to come up with another one of her lessons. She absolutely loved that word, and it was her favorite way to dress up being mean, because if I ever let a tear fall, she told me I was being too sensitive, and if I reached out for help, she called me helpless. She had a way of taking any normal mistake a child makes and turning it into a reason to make me feel small, and my father was always right there behind her, with a smirk on his face like they treated everything like a game at my expense. They both got a kick out of playing. I remember being 8 years old and asking for a new pair of sneakers because the ones I had were worn through at the toes, and my mother told me I was acting like a spoiled brat before marching me over to a bench by the mall food court and telling me that if I wanted to live in the real world, I better start by sitting there alone to learn that nobody in this life owes me a thing. They left me sitting on that bench for nearly 3 hours, and I still remember the smell of cinnamon and butter from the pretzel stand while I fought back tears, because I knew that crying was just entertainment for them, and when they finally walked back up, my father just laughed and asked my mother if she owed him $20, since he had guessed I would still be sitting in that exact same spot. Then when I was 10, I came out of a youth football game crying, because some boys had been making fun of me in the parking lot, and instead of giving me a hug, my parents drove to the far end of the stadium lot and told me to get out and stay there until after the sun went down, because my mother claimed that tears made people weak, and weakness only brought on more trouble. I just sat there on that cold concrete curb with my arms wrapped around my knees, watching the trucks pull away one by one, until they finally came back an hour later, eating fast food. They hadn't bothered to get for me, and they didn't offer a single apology. My dad thought it was a riot. That I was still standing there, and he told me he had a bet going that I would have tried to hitch a ride or beg some stranger for help. That was the way they lived, where everything was a test or a punchline at my expense, like they needed to make the world even harder than it already was. Just to prove a point, the strangest thing about it was that they never saw themselves as being mean, because they talked about building character and having grit and getting me ready for reality using all those big noble words to cover up how ugly they were actually being. They would tell anyone who asked that they were just raising an independent girl. But independence wasn't what they were growing in that house. It was fear and silence, and a need to always be looking over my shoulder. I learned how to read the look in their eyes before I ever dared to speak, and I got real good at making myself invisible in my own home, hoping that if I stayed quiet and useful enough, they might just skip over me when it came time for their next little experiment. The only place where I felt like a real human being was on a piece of paper, because I was always drawing on the back of old receipts, or in the margins of my schoolwork using sketch pads I bought with my own babysitting money. I drew pictures of bedrooms with locks on the inside of the doors, and windows full of bright light, and women standing on top of mountains with absolutely nobody behind them, and while I couldn't have told you why I was doing it back. Then I realized now that I was trying to draw a map that would lead me out of my own life for good. What finally pushed me over the edge was something so small. Most parents wouldn't even remember it a week later. But I had managed to get a B+ in art class, which was the only subject that made me feel like I had a reason to get out of bed, and I was actually proud of myself until I walked through that front door and saw my mother holding my report card, like it was a piece of evidence in a courtroom. She looked at me and asked how a girl who spent every waking second drawing could still find a way to let her down in the one class she supposedly cared about. And my father chimed in, saying that I was probably just getting lazy, while my mother added that I had probably started thinking that just trying hard was going to be enough to get by in this world. That night, I sat in my bedroom pretending to focus on my homework while I listened to them talking down in the kitchen with their voices low, and full of that amused tone that always made my stomach tie itself into a knot of pure dread. You ever notice how hope can be a real dangerous thing when you are being raised by people who treat your heart like a plaything? Well, let me tell you about the day that hope finally died, and the version of me you see today started to take shape. My mother told me I needed a lesson that would stick with me forever, and my father was right there ready to put money on it. The very next morning, they were acting so cheerful, it actually made my skin crawl because of how fake it felt. My mother was in the kitchen flipping pancakes, and my father actually asked if I wanted a glass of orange juice. Which never happened. Back then they told me we were heading out for a day trip to Chicago, just the three of us, and for a split second I was dumb enough and desperate enough to think they were trying to fix things. Maybe they had finally cooled off after that fight about my report card, and this was the only way. They knew how to say, "Sorry, I should have known better though," because the whole ride from Willow Creek into the city just felt wrong, in a way I couldn't put into words. Yet my father had the radio turned way up and was drumming on the steering wheel, like he didn't have a care in the world, while my mother kept twisting around in her seat to hit me with questions she already knew the answers to. Like, did I think I was smart, or was I ready for the real world, or did I think life cared if I was scared or not? Every time I opened my mouth, they just looked at each other like I was the punchline of a joke, and by the time I saw the skyline hitting the horizon, I had that familiar heavy feeling in my gut, telling me something bad was coming, and I wasn't going to be allowed to get ready for it. We pulled up near Union Station around noon, and I had never seen a place that big, or that packed in my entire life. It was like a whole city crammed under one roof, with people rushing every which way with their suitcases and businessmen looking like they were on a mission. I stayed as close to my parents as I could, because I had no idea where else to go or what to do. Once we got inside that main hall, my mother pointed to this massive stone pillar near the entrance and told me to just stand right there while they went to move the car and grab some lunch. She said it would be maybe 15 or 20 minutes at most, and when I asked if I could just come along, my father let out a laugh so loud that people actually stopped and stared at us. He told me I was 12 years old, not a toddler, and my mother leaned in real close to tell me not to go embarrassing her in front of everyone, so I just nodded my head and stood by that pillar while they walked away. I remember staring at that huge station clock until my eyes started to sting. 15 minutes went by, then 30, then 45, and at first I kept making excuses for them, telling myself that parking was a nightmare or the lines for food were just too long. Maybe they just got turned around in the crowd. But after an hour, my chest started to ache, and by the time an hour and a half had passed, I could feel a wave of panic rising up so fast, it made my hands shake. I had exactly $9 in my pocket, no cell phone, no address written down anywhere, and not the slightest clue how a train worked. I had never felt smaller or more alone. I would walk a few feet away from that pillar and then sprint back because they told me not to move, and even then I was still terrified of breaking the rules and making them angry. The station just kept getting louder as the day went on, and every time the intercom crackled, my heart would skip a beat, while every woman with dark hair made me snap my head around, hoping it was her. Every second felt like it was being stretched out on purpose, just to be cruel, and then I saw it through those big front windows. Our car was gliding slowly past the street outside, and my whole body just lit up with a relief so strong, almost started laughing. I ran toward the glass, waving my arms like a crazy person, thinking for a fraction of a second that they had finally come back for me. My father was behind the wheel, and my mother was sitting right there in the passenger seat, and both of them were looking straight at me. My father was the first one to smile, but it wasn't the look of a parent who found their lost kid. It was the smirk of a man watching a joke land exactly how he wanted it to. My mother rolled down her window just a crack so I could hear her over the roar of the traffic, and she yelled out that she bet $50. I couldn't even find my way back home, and then she just started laughing, and my father joined right in, giving me this pathetic little thumbs up, like they were proud of themselves for being so clever. Then the car just kept moving and disappeared into the flow of traffic. And that was the exact moment the world changed for me forever. It was one thing to be scared they might forget me, or to suspect they were teaching me a lesson, but it was something else entirely, to see them choose to do it, and to watch them actually enjoy the sight of me being terrified. I realized right then that my fear wasn't just a side effect of what they were doing. It was the whole point of the game. I stood there like I was frozen to the floor until a stranger brushed past me and told me to excuse them, and that sound of a normal voice finally snapped me back into my skin. I ran back inside because I didn't know where else to move, and I just wandered from one end of that station to the other, crying on and off and wiping my face every few minutes, because I was still ashamed of being upset, since my parents had trained me to believe that showing any emotion was a failure. I tried to think of anyone I could call, but my world was empty, and trying to imagine the way back home felt like trying to map out a different country. I would sit on a bench for a while, and then stand back up and walk in circles until my legs started to give out, and at some point I just stopped expecting them to show back up. The waiting was over, and the abandonment had officially started, and that might sound like a small shift in words, but when you are 12 years old, it feels like the ground just opened up and swallowed you whole. I spent nearly 3 hours in that station after they drove away long enough for the light outside to start fading and for the crowds to thin out and fill back up again. I stopped thinking in full sentences and just started moving on pure instinct, staying away from the doors, because I was scared that if I stepped out onto the street, I would get even more lost. And I stayed far away from the police, because my parents always told me that authority figures only made things worse if you caused trouble. I didn't talk to any strangers, either because the same people who dumped me there had spent years telling me that asking for help was a sign of weakness, and looking back I think that was the meanest thing they ever did to me. They trained me not to trust a soul, and then left me in a place where trust was the only thing that could have kept me safe. The person who finally caught sight of me was a station worker named Elena Ramirez, who looked to be in her 50s with tired eyes, and a voice that was so calm it made you want to tell her everything. Even if you were scared to death, she had seen me walk past the same row of vending machines about a dozen times, so she stopped me near a hallway by the offices and asked if I was lost. I lied right to her face immediately and said I was just waiting for my folks, but she asked how long I had been standing there, and I told her I didn't really know. Then she asked me if I had eaten anything yet. Sometimes it is the simplest question in the world that finally brings your whole house of cards crashing down, and for me it was a stranger asking if I had anything to eat, because that is when I just lost it completely, I started sobbing so hard that I could barely catch my breath, and all that shame I had been choking on since lunchtime just came pouring out of me in one big mess. I told her how they had dumped me there, and how they actually drove past and laughed at my face, while my mother put a price tag on my terror by betting $50 I could not find my way back home on my own. Elena Ramirez did not act like my folks at all, and she did not tell me to dry my eyes or act like I was being a drama queen. She just got down on my level and looked me dead in the eye and promised me that I was safe and that she was going to help me get through this. And then the security and the transit cops showed up. One officer sat with me to get my story, while another one went to pull the security footage from the front entrance, and they saw the whole thing plain as day, confirming I had been standing there for hours, and that a car matching our description had slowed down by the curb before peeling off again, and that evidence ended up being a big deal. Later, but right then, all I knew was that the grown-ups around me had suddenly gotten real serious. One cop started writing down my parents' names and where we lived and the name of their store, while another one brought me some water and crackers, since I had not had a single bite of food since breakfast. When they finally got my parents on the phone, I could only hear one side of the call, but I will never forget the look on that officer's face as it went from being professional to pure disbelief. In about 10 seconds flat, he asked them if they were coming back to get me right away, and then he just stood there listening in silence before he told them straight out that leaving a 12-year-old at a busy station is not a lesson in being independent. It is child abandonment, and hearing him say those words made me go cold. But not because it was mean, it was because it was the truth. By the time the evening rolled around, I was in a small room with a social worker who told me that because my parents were refusing to come back and were still acting like this was just a parenting choice, I could not just go back home, even if they had a change of heart. So I was going into emergency care until a judge could sort it all out. I did not understand the legal words she was using, but I understood the way she looked at me, like she knew I had not been safe for a long time. Before that day, I was absolutely terrified when they told me I had to stay with a foster family, because you always hear the worst stories about those places. But then I met Mark and Rachel Carter, and they were just normal people who were not trying to act like they were perfect or something. He was a photographer with ink stains all over his fingers, and she was a teacher who smelled like school paper and lotion, and their house actually felt like people lived in it. With a warm lamp in the hallway, and pictures on the walls, and a dog bed in the corner. Even if the dog was asleep somewhere else, Laura asked if I wanted some spaghetti. Or Soup and Mark asked if I wanted the light left on in the hall, and nobody raised their voice when I said I did not know, or poked fun at me when I started crying at the table, because I was just too worn out to keep pretending I was doing fine. I barely slept a wink that first night, because every car door and every floorboard creak made me sit bolt upright in bed. But even through all that fear, I could not stop thinking about how a total stranger at a train station had shown me more genuine kindness in 5 minutes than my own mother had in years, and I did not have the right words for it yet, but I knew the world looked different now, because once you see that there are people out there who will actually protect you, it becomes impossible to keep telling yourself that cruelty is just normal life. The next few days felt like I was living in a movie about someone else, wandering from meetings with social workers to therapy sessions, and then into a big courtroom downtown where adults talked about my future, like it was something fragile and important. My parents showed up with a lawyer, acting just like they always did at home, looking offended and kind of amused that anyone was making a big deal out of this. My mother wore a fancy blazer, and her pearls, like looking respectable, could just erase the fact that she dumped her kid, and my father just leaned back with his arms crossed. Like the whole thing was just an annoyance he had to deal with. They did not even try to deny leaving me at the station. Which was the craziest part, they just kept saying it was a controlled lesson designed to build grit, and that kids in this country were getting too soft. I sat there listening to them, and I realized they were never going to be the kind of parents who understood what they had done, because if they had any heart at all, they would have turned that car around before they ever got home. The therapist wrote a report that used words like emotional abuse and neglect, and hearing that felt like someone finally opened a window in a room where the air had gone stale. I had spent my whole life thinking everything was my fault, because that was easier than believing my parents were choosing to hurt me on purpose. But that report made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding. It was abuse, plain and simple. When the judge asked me if I wanted to go back home while they monitored us, I said no. So fast it probably shocked everyone in the room. My mother looked at me like I had slapped her across the face, and my father mumbled something about me being ungrateful, but the judge did not even flinch. The plan was supposed to be a long road of classes and therapy to try and get us back together, which sounds fair enough on paper, but my parents just took the whole thing as a personal insult to their pride. You ever see a person choose their own pride over their own flesh and blood? Well, I have, and it is a sight that stays with you long after the ink on the court papers has dried. The truth is, my parents absolutely hated the idea of anybody looking under the hood of our family because they could not stand the thought of some outsider having a say in how they did things. They had spent years polishing up a perfect image for the neighbours, and now they had teachers and therapists and court officers seeing the real versions of them behind closed doors. My father spent more time complaining about what all this was doing to the reputation of his stores than he did about the fact that he was losing his daughter, and my mother kept digging her heels in, saying she was not about to let the state tell her how to raise her own kid. But then came the moment that changed everything. When the court laid it all out on the line for them, they were given a choice to either sign up for a 2-year program to try and get me back, or they could just sign a paper and give up their rights as parents. And without missing a beat, they chose to walk away. My heart did not just shatter right there in the courtroom. Like you might expect instead, everything just went dead quiet inside of me, because I had spent every waking second of my life trying to be good enough to keep them from turning on me. And in the end, they decided to throw me away, rather than admit they were ever wrong. That is the reality that stuck with me the longest, because the system did not come in and steal me away. They just handed me over like a piece of unwanted luggage just to protect their own egos. Things started moving a lot faster after that, and since the Bennetts were already licensed foster parents, they stopped being just a place to stay and started feeling like home. Mark began leaving out old photography magazines and art books for me because he had picked up on how much I loved to draw, and Laura made a point to knock before she ever stepped into my room. Which might sound like a small thing to most people, but when you grow up in a house where you do not have a single inch of privacy, it feels like a huge act of respect. They figured out which foods made me nervous because of the ways I used to be punished at the dinner table, and they never forced me to look them in the eye when I was feeling upset. They did not demand that I love them, or act grateful, or trust them right away. They just stayed right where they were, being steady, and that kind of consistency feels almost like a miracle to a kid who has never had a floor beneath her feet. The adoption went through after enough time had passed for the paperwork to look official, but in our hearts it had happened long before the judge ever picked up a pen. When they asked if I wanted to pick a new name, I did not have to think twice because Emily Harper belonged to that terrified girl standing in a train station with $9 in her pocket, wondering if she even had a family anymore, while Olivia Carter belonged to someone brand new, who had her own desk and a family that did not treat her fear like a punchline. I still remember that first night after it was all legal. When Laura put fresh sheets on my bed, just like she did every Sunday, and Mark left a brand new sketchbook on my desk without making some big speech about how lucky I was. They just acted like I had belonged to them from the very start, and that quiet way of loving me did more to heal my soul than any dramatic moment ever could, because it taught me that real love does not put you through a test to see if you deserve it. It just makes a place for you before you even know how to sit down and relax. Of course, the healing did not happen all at once, and it sure as hell did not move in a straight line. People love to tell stories where one good deed fixes everything, and the broken kid just turns into a butterfly the second they get a better home. But my life was not a fairy tale for a long time. My body still reacted to kindness, like it was a baited trap, and if Laura told me she would be back in 15 minutes after a trip to the store, I would have to fight every urge I had to stand by the window and watch for her car until she pulled back into the driveway. If Mark was even a few minutes late picking me up because of traffic, I could feel a panic rising up so fast it made my hands go numb. I hated waiting in public places, and I could not stand being told to stay put or hearing someone say they would be right back. Therapy helped some, but it was a long, slow road that forced me to say the ugliest parts of my life out loud until my body finally started believing what my head already knew. I learned fancy words for what I was feeling, like trauma and hypervigilance, and I realized that being hurt over and over does not actually make you stronger. Like cruel people want you to think it just makes you real good at sensing danger, and terrible at ever finding any rest through all of that. The Bennets never tried to rush me along. They showed up for every school play and helped me with my homework, and they remembered exactly what things would set me off while letting me keep my door shut when I just needed to be alone. They did not try to pretend the past never happened. They just helped me build a life where the past was not the only thing people saw. When they looked at me, eventually art became more than just a way to hide it, became my voice and my proof that I could create something beautiful without needing anyone else to give me the green light. I poured every bit of myself into it through high school and college, and even those late-night sessions at the Art Institute of Chicago. Moving back to the city that used to terrify me was not about making a point. At first, it was just the best school for me, but somewhere along the way I realized I was taking that city back for myself. The same place where I had been abandoned became the ground where I built my own foundation. I studied graphic design and worked hard and kept going to therapy while learning how to stand tall without feeling like I had to shrink myself down. After I graduated, I headed out to Denver for a job with a firm that helped small businesses find their identity, and for the first time, it felt like the map was finally on my side, because Denver gave me the room I needed with new streets and fresh air that was dry enough to help me think straight. I started taking on my own clients and eventually opened up my own studio, building a name for myself by helping people tell their stories through clean visuals. And it is kind of funny in a dark way that my whole career is built on clarity and truth after growing up in a house full of lies. I ended up meeting Ethan through a buddy at a party, and he was the kind of guy who was patient without trying too hard, and he was real tough to rattle on our third date. I let him know my family situation was a mess, and by the fifth date, I gave him a few more pieces of the puzzle. When I finally told him the whole story about Union Station, he did not jump in or try to fix it with some cheap line about how things happen for a reason. He just reached across the table and took my hand and told me that it should have never happened to me, and the simple way he said that almost knocked the wind right out of me. You ever get the feeling that no matter how many miles you put between you and a bad memory, the world is still just a small enough place for it to track you down by your trail of digital breadcrumbs? Ethan and I built our life together, the same way I had to rebuild my own heart, brick by brick, and on purpose, making sure there was plenty of room for honesty and the truth. We got married in a quiet little ceremony where Mark walked me down the aisle and Laura was fussing over the back of my dress. Trying her best not to let a tear fall, we ended up adopting a rescue dog named Rocky, who is a little mutt with a torn-up ear and the kind of cautious soul you only see in creatures that have been left behind way too soon. I went ahead and blocked every single account my biological parents ever tried to use to find me, whether it was Facebook or Instagram or some old email address. I even swapped my phone number that one time. A holiday voicemail from an Illinois line left me shaking for an hour. I did not talk about them unless I absolutely had to, and I never set foot in Willow Creek or used my old name at all. Most days, I could go for weeks without ever even thinking about Emily Harper. That was the peaceful life I had made for myself by the time those calls started rolling in. I had a good husband and a studio full of steady clients and morning walks with Rocky and Sunday calls with Mark and Laura. It was a life so quiet and whole that I used to wonder if peace always felt this strange to folks who didn't have to fight tooth and nail just to get it. Then my phone started screaming with 29 missed calls from Illinois, and the ground under my feet started to shift. I had a voicemail waiting and an email from an address I didn't recognize, and even a message request on LinkedIn, which was the only platform I kept public for my business, and that was the detail that really got to me, because it meant someone had actually put in the work to find me. Someone finally connected the woman named Olivia Carter to that little girl they had laughed at through a car window all those years ago. I just sat there at the kitchen counter with my phone in my hand and Rocky leaning against my leg, while Ethan watched the color drain right out of my face. I had spent 20 years making sure the past stayed in the ground where it belonged, but whatever was happening now had dug it up with both hands, and it was not going away. That voicemail wasn't even from my mother. It was from my younger sister, Chloe Davis. I hadn't heard her voice since she was a tiny thing, following me around the house in mismatched socks. Too young to know why the air in our home always felt like it was about to catch fire. Her voice sounded a lot older and rougher, like life had been leaning on her pretty hard. She told me that our mother had late-stage cancer and our father had suffered a stroke about 6 months back, and then she told me the stores were gone, not just struggling but completely closed up and sold off for a loss, because the story I thought was buried in those old court records had finally come out in the worst way possible for them. See, some relative had posted the truth about the train station in a local group after my mother had the nerve to leave a comment on someone else's post about how kids these days needed more discipline, and that one little comment opened up the floodgates for everyone. Neighbours started talking, and a retired clerk who probably should have minded her own business, but didn't hinted that the rumours were true, and someone even dug up an old newspaper clipping about the abandonment investigation. Then a former employee from one of their shops joined in and told everyone exactly what my parents were like when the doors were closed. The whole image they had spent 30 years building just crumbled in public, and it was fast and it was ugly. People stopped coming into the stores and started driving to the next town over, just so they wouldn't have to give my folks another dime. Their church friends went silent and the civic groups stopped calling them back. Willow Creek had once protected them with all that polite gossip, but now it had turned on them using those same tools. Chloe Davis told me they were living in some subsidized apartment on the edge of town, with no house and no stores, and no version of the old family left to hide inside. Then she said the one thing that explained why I had 29 missed calls instead of just one polite message. They wanted me to come back, but it wasn't because they had suddenly grown a conscience or got brave enough to face the truth. It was because they were flat out of options and they were terrified of dying all by themselves. I asked Chloe Davis why on earth she was even calling me when she knew I had every reason to stay gone, and after a long silence, she told me she wanted me to hear the truth from someone who wasn't lying to her. She said she had cut ties too, not years ago like I did, but recently after she became a mother and actually went and got copies of the court papers to see what really happened. When I vanished, my parents had spent years feeding her some watered-down version of the truth, telling her I had just overreacted and that the state had overreached and that my foster parents had brainwashed me into wanting to be their daughter. But Chloe Davis said reading those actual records felt like getting hit by a truck, and she looked at her own little boy and realized she could never let people like that get anywhere near him. Hearing that should have made me feel like I had finally won, but it did not feel like a victory at all. It feels like the story is finally coming to a head. So I have to ask you when the people who threw you away finally come crawling back, because they have nowhere else to go. Do you think mercy is a gift you give to them, or is it just another way to let them back into your life to finish what they started? You ever get that feeling where you are just plain exhausted in a place way deeper than where your anger lives? Because that is exactly where I was after Chloe Davis finished talking, and she asked me if I would come back home, but all I could tell her was that I would have to think on it. Ethan reminded me that I did not owe those people a single thing, and Laura told me that whatever I decided had to be for my own peace of mind, rather than their comfort mark. Just sat there real quiet and said that some folks only go looking for a bridge once they have finished burning the house down. I sat with that thought all through the night, and by the time the sun came up I knew one thing for certain: I was not going back there to save them. I was going back to end this whole thing, using my own voice and my own terms. I flew into Chicago 2 days later and drove the rest of the way to the hospital where my mother was staying, and the whole place smelled like heavy disinfectant and stale fear. My father looked way older than I had imagined, and he looked smaller too, like all that sickness and the public disgrace had finally stripped him down to the ordinary man hiding under the performance. My mother still had her face all arranged just right, even while she was half sick, like dignity was just something she could put on like a shade of lipstick for a second. Then nobody said a word, and then my mother started crying before I even had a chance to sit down, and it was not a quiet cry either. It was the kind of performance built to pull all the focus in the room. She said my name, but she used the old one, and I corrected her right then and there, once and only once. Telling her it was Sophia, she just nodded and dabbed at her eyes while my father spoke up and said they had made some mistakes. Mistakes, that is the same cowardly word people use when the truth is just too ugly to say out loud. So I told them no, a mistake is missing a turn on the highway or forgetting to grab milk at the grocery store. But what they did was deliberate. I told them they left a 12-year-old girl in a train station in a city she did not know, and they laughed while she panicked, and then spent 20 years lying about it just to protect their own skin. My father started to open his mouth, probably to make an excuse, but I did not travel all that way to hear another defense wrapped up in soft words. I told them they had turned my fear into a game, and the reason they were sitting there right now without a business or a shred of respect, or either of their daughters by their side, was because games eventually end. I told them that people find out the truth, and children grow up, and reality has a way of catching up even in small towns that think silence can bury a secret forever. My mother asked if I could ever find it in me to forgive them, and I told her that forgiveness is not a debt I owe to people who only come looking for me when their own lives fall. Apart then, I said the one sentence I had been carrying in my heart since I was 12 years old. I told them you bet on whether I could find my way home, and I did, I just did not come back to yours. They both started crying then, but for the first time in my life, their tears did not move me at all. I was not being mean, and I did not yell or call them names, and that was the part that surprised me the most, because revenge did not feel loud when it finally happened. It felt cold and clear and exact. I told them I would not be paying their bills or managing their care or opening the door to talk ever again, and I told them Chloe Davis had every right to keep her child far away from them. I told them my family was back in Colorado and in Illinois with the people who had actually earned the right to use that word. Then I stood up to leave. My father asked me if this was really goodbye, and I looked him square in the eye and told him it had been goodbye for 20 years, and that they were just the last. People on earth to understand that I walked out of that room after 20 minutes, and I did not look back once when I got to the parking lot. The air felt thin and bright, and I stood there with my hands shaking, not because I was sorry, but because of that strange feeling of release you get when something that has been haunting you finally has a shape you can leave behind on the flight back home. I thought about that little girl at Union Station who used to believe that being abandoned meant she was unwanted forever, but she was wrong. She was just unwanted by two broken people who thought being cruel was the same thing as being strong, but she was never unworthy of being loved. There is a massive difference between those two things, and learning that is what saved my life. If there is any lesson to take away from what happened to me, it is this: abuse does not turn into discipline just because a parent uses cleaner words to describe it. Humiliation does not build character, and fear does not make a child stronger. It only makes them grow old before their time, and walking away from people who hurt you. Even if you share the same blood is not being bitter. Sometimes it is the healthiest thing you will ever do for yourself. I did not leave that hospital feeling like I did something wrong. I left feeling like I had been educated by my own survival. The family you are born into might shape your wounds, but they do not get to define your future. Real love does not laugh when you are scared, and real family does not put you through a test to see if you can survive without them. Real healing starts the very second you stop calling cruelty a lesson and start calling it exactly what it was. And once you do that, you can build a life that is so honest and so steady and so full of peace that even the people who broke you cannot ever take it back.